Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Open Observability Talks. I'm your host, Utan Horvitz, and here at Open Observability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So, as I always say, may the open source be with you. And for those joining us on the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, do feel free to share comments and questions on the chat. It will definitely make things more interesting for us here on the show. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. We're streaming the episode in September, aka PromCon month. And PromCon is the flagship event of the Prometheus community and ecosystem. I've been covering PromCon here on the show in the past few years. And this year, there's a major highlight, a major release, the long-awaited Prometheus 3.0. Let the drums roll. I've invited Prometheus creator, Julius Volz, to join me on this episode to take us through the 3.0 release, as well as many more Prometheus ecosystem updates. So I'd like to invite Julius to the stream. Hey, Julius, good morning.
Hi there. Nice to be here.
Hey, glad to have you on the show. And where are you joining us from?
I'm here in Berlin, where it's currently hot, and we don't have AC, but I'm dealing with it. I have a fan pointed at me.
Yeah, that's a heat wave there in a few countries in Europe. So that's the global warming is definitely taking its toll. Definitely. So great, thanks for joining us despite the heat, and gearing up towards the exciting PromCon. That's a big month, the month of PromCon, and I'd like to start with I suspect that many of the audience know you and know the project Prometheus. For those who don't know, it was invented internally at SoundCloud, and you were there. You created Prometheus. So maybe we'll start by you, if you can tell us your history gist on how Prometheus was born.
Oh, yeah, the old history. So that was 12 years ago by now, 2012. Matt Proud and myself both came from Google. We didn't know each other yet, but we joined SoundCloud roughly around the same time. And SoundCloud had a cluster scheduler already. They had built it in-house before Docker even existed, based on raw LXC containers. And they were hitting the problem that all the existing open source monitoring systems were not made for dynamic environments where services and their processes, their instances get scheduled on random hosts and ports every day, right? And you have to somehow monitor every process and make sense of what's happening where. And we, coming from Google, were tasked with making SoundCloud more stable and more reliable because it was down a lot or slow. And we were basically missing Google's Borgmon monitoring system, which we had used in Google. We didn't know the code, but we were users as site reliability engineers there. And that was a system to really monitor such dynamic cluster schedulers, which Google had internally with Borg for a long time already. And then we get the crazy idea after a lot of studies and, working to try to make everything work with Graphite and Statsd and Nagios and all the existing things that SoundCloud was using. We were like, okay, we do need something else. And we basically need something like Borgmon. And that's how Prometheus started. So we just started building the project that then eventually became Prometheus in our free time and gradually introduced it at SoundCloud. And, there are the core new features at the time were a dimensional label-based data model versus just a flat metric name, a real query language that allowed you to, not a hierarchy one like in Statsd or Graphite. Real query language, so you can do proper math between whole sets of time series, like this vector math concept that you have in PromQL. You have a service discovery, so your monitoring system can actively discover all the processes and things that should exist in your infrastructure, and then also through the discovery, know what they are, so attach labels to them, and then also go out to them and actively fetch metrics. So it's pull-based in that way as well. And then we also had, storage-wise, better support for short-lived time series, because in those environments, let's say nowadays it's Kubernetes, which Prometheus also works well with. You have these pods, and then you scale up a new revision of your app, and then like all the pod identities change and they're part of the label of your time series. So you'll have a whole new set of time series and the old one is gone, and maybe each set only lasts a couple of hours. So you don't want to be creating like one file per time series anymore, like Graphite did in the way back then. And so, all these things work way better now with Prometheus. And of course, it still works very well in those more static configurations as well. Like if you just have a couple of servers, they all run like static loads. Like this one has the database server and this one has the web server, like very old school. You can also totally monitor that with Prometheus. But yeah, that's it. Definitely, if you have one of those more dynamic cloud native situations, you want something like Prometheus. Maybe one last thing that I should mention was kind of the format for getting metrics out of things. Like Prometheus, nowadays it's more and more common, but back then a lot of monitoring was just kind of probing things from the outside, checking if a server is running, or like sending a test request, or something like this. Whereas Prometheus has way more focus on white box monitoring, where you instrument your service process with one of the either Prometheus client library, or the format that you have to emit over HTTP is so simple that you could even emit metrics from bash script, for example. It's just like lines of text. So we wanted to make it like as easy as possible to get metrics out of anything you care about. And so now the community has also written like thousands of exporters to basically integrate with any third-party system you have that cannot be directly instrumented, right? Whether it's like some aquarium controller or a Minecraft server or a network switch or whatever. That's I think one of the other strengths, just the ease of instrumenting things.
Yeah, that's amazing. And although we do have also, especially for the native histograms, we do have something that is not only textual, but we'll talk about it later.
Yep.
But definitely the easy, maybe even human readable format for relaying metrics, that's an advantage. And then after having it as an internal tool within SoundCloud, then you took it open source, and then it contributed to the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I know I'm a CNCF ambassador, so I should say that, but I think actually that was a real good synergy. That was the second project to have joined and graduated after Kubernetes itself. So, and the synergy between Kubernetes and Prometheus, we were very humble before saying it works nicely with Kubernetes, but it's actually, I think today, the de facto standard for monitoring Kubernetes because of the very, very out-of-the-box support of Kubernetes, right? So.
Yeah, at least if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you're very likely to have some kind of Prometheus-ish components in there. Even if it's no longer the native Prometheus server, you might have something else that pulls Prometheus-compatible metrics from Kubernetes endpoints because they all have Prometheus metrics, for example. So yeah, usually you will have something Prometheus-ish happening in your Kubernetes cluster as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely today like one of the prominent projects in the CNCF. Again, I even wore the shirt especially for those who see us on the video cast or the live stream, especially for that. And now let's fast forward to today. So as I mentioned to our audience, it's been a long time awaiting the major release of Prometheus. Prometheus has been known for very, very stable methodology of the maintainers, very reliable in terms of backwards compatibility and stability of the APIs and so on. So what everyone is concerned about, major releases and everything, it hasn't happened in a long time. Now it's happening, and it's going to be announced, as I said, it's part of PromCon. I put the link, by the way, for the live stream audience of PromCon on the chat if you're interested. For those on the podcast apps, it's part of the show notes as well. So tell us, by the way, I should have credit you with that. You're also part of the founders of PromCon as a conference, right?
Right. Yeah, I basically ran the first PromCon almost by myself, and then but now it's other people doing it. I'm not really involved anymore, except for reviewing submissions and so on. But yeah, I started that. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That was 2016. Yeah, basically 2016. I kind of just got the idea. Prometheus was taking off community-wise, and I just thought, hey, let's do a conference. Let's just try and see what happens. And then it was sold out within like minutes or hours. It was tiny. It was like 80 people at a Google office, the first one. And then the next years it got larger, like hundreds of people. This year, which is so next week, but for everyone listening to the recording, it's already happened now. It's over. It will be in Berlin, in a pretty big venue, the Tempodrom. It looks like a big tent in the middle of Berlin. So I'm curious to see what it's like and how many people will actually be there, because it has a lot of space and we will not fill it up. I see like some international stars there sometimes, so it's quite big. So I'm curious to see what it's going to be like. But yeah, Prometheus 3.0 is going to be one of the major themes there, and I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, so let's start. I've been following you in your tweets in the past week or a couple of weeks at least. I've seen your tweets switching to short clips of the UI experimentation and things that you've been developing. So specifically on the Prometheus 3.0, with all the credits of Prometheus in general, specifically this is one that you're doing hands-on. I've seen that in the work. So tell us a bit about the new Prometheus UI. I know it's a change of framework and also change of user experience. Take us through this change.
Yeah, and should I maybe talk a little bit about the idea of Prometheus 3 first, because the UI is kind of a sub part of it? Could make sense. Just to give people an idea of what this is even about. So about a year ago, we were sitting in a dev summit and we were thinking like, hey, maybe to reinvigorate the project also. It could be a good PR thing and just like, bring new vitality into the project, to have a 3.0 and say like, hey, we're still doing major stuff here, which we are. So that was actually one reason. And the other reason is like for 3.0, like why were we at 2 dot something for such a long time? Now we're at like 2.50 something. Because we're backend infrastructure people and we're conservative, we don't want to break people, right? Like changing the major version means now someone who updates their Prometheus server is worried that if they just pull a new version and start it, that something will break. The good news is that nothing much will break. Like most people will not notice any breakage, but it did give us an opportunity to remove some real old crafty stuff, like especially mainly like 4 experimental feature flags, which now they were already deprecated, but now they're not supported at all anymore because they're already the default behavior in Prometheus, for example, right? Like very minor stuff like that. The exact details will be listed in the release notes of 3.0, but usually, like, unless you're doing something really funky, you will probably just be able to start up a 3.0 and notice no breaking changes, or very minor ones. And then I was thinking, okay, if we do that, and of course, then other people wanted to get other cool features into 3.0 as well, which we'll talk about. But I was thinking, okay, we cannot release 3.0, especially if it's going to be a nice PR event with the ugly old UI. I am allowed to say that because I built all the generations of Prometheus UI. The very first one, which was uglyish, and then the second one, which was less uglyish, and now this third one. Again, like so far, I'm the only builder of that. I've been madly pushing to a branch since a couple of months and just doing my thing in there. And the idea here is, the old UI grew so first of all, it's based on React and Bootstrap. React is cool, still want to use that for the new one, but Bootstrap and the framework, the version of that we've been using, I don't know, has this outdated look, doesn't have a lot of cool built-in components. And a lot of people added just their favorite feature to the different pages of the old UI. And so now some pages look really cluttered with a million checkboxes and differently aligned and colored filters and so on. Like if you look at the alerts page, the query page, or the targets pages, they're my favorite culprits. And so I was thinking, and also I've learned a lot more about like how I would do certain things in React and so on. I'm not a front-end engineer by training. So I've just, with every React app I'm building, I'm learning a little bit more, and it's still probably very ugly code, but It's getting better, and I'm doing things more in the way I like. So the new UI, the idea is, okay, it's still going to be React. We are going to use Mentine as a UI component framework. That's like a React native component framework that brings with it a lot of default, nice-looking components, whether it's buttons or selectors and all these kind of things. So it comes with a lot of awesome functionality out of the hood that allows me as a non-real front-end engineer to build a pretty-ish front end. So it's going to be more pretty. It's going to be way less cluttered. It's completely rebuilt under the hood with some code, of course, adapted from the old UI. And then the idea is that there will also be new features. So it's not going to be a complete departure in terms of becoming something totally different feature-wise. But especially for the query view where you build PromQL queries, I have a new metrics explorer that was ported over from PromLens, where you can better explore the metrics you have with their metadata and the labels on them, and then insert them into your PromQL text field. And I have this
maybe
tree view
just
where
if I may stop you here, you mentioned PromLens. I'm not sure that everyone is familiar, and that's a cute side project. Another side project of yours.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a word about the query builder?
Yeah.
That is
So
now open source and part of Prometheus, of course. But
exactly, I do have my own. The way I make money is my company PromLabs. So nobody pays me. Well, actually, people do sponsor me also for some open source work. So thanks, for example, to Schwarz IT and Puzzle in Switzerland. But the main income, like how to learn a living, is through live trainings and courses and so on. So that's my company. But before I did the live trainings and courses, I built a commercial software for building PromQL queries called PromLens. And the idea there was that just having a text input is not so great. You want to actually see the whole structure of your query, the abstract syntax tree laid out visually with every subquery, every sub-expression visualized as its own box that you can click on and where you can see what data you have at that sub-expression. And then in PromLens, I had more features. You could even edit in the tree view. There was like a full form-based editing functionality in there. And you can also click on a node and then you can get it explained. Or if it's a binary operator, it will show you the matching behavior of the two operands and so on. So you can fix your vector matching more easily than if you just have a text input box. And so my goal now with the new UI is, so PromLens is no longer commercial. Chronosphere helped me open sources. They basically sponsored an open sourcing of it in the end. So it's already a standalone part of the Prometheus project, but you have to run it as a separate server. You can run it against, different Prometheus compatible backends. But we want to have some of the features of PromLens in the Prometheus server's own UI built in. And that's kind of what I'm working on right now. So this tree view, the visualization of your query and its sub-expressions, I'm currently porting over into the new UI as well. And I think, lots of people are going to like that, especially.
We actually covered PromLens and it's joining the Prometheus, open sourcing and joining the Prometheus ecosystem on the show here about a couple of years ago. I put the link here now on the for the live stream viewers, and obviously it will be also on the show notes. So check it out. Lots of exciting stuff back in the day, and a lot has been done since, because this was also part of this was, by the way, an episode I had with Julien Pivotto, another prominent core maintainer of Prometheus. And the UI approach and UX approach that brought with it, I think that's amazing. That's also what you also show on your little snippets there on Twitter. So if you follow on Twitter, if you're on X or Twitter, do follow
LinkedIn. You can also see it on LinkedIn.
Or on LinkedIn as well. Yeah, by the way, all the links for Julius's profiles you'll find on the episode description, so don't worry about that. But definitely worthwhile. So you started talking about the UI, freshened up UI experience. That part of that is actually influenced or even ported over from PromLens.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be, in the end, everything's going to look nicer, and it's going to be less cluttered, and it will have some cool extra features. We're not going to take the Prometheus UI into a completely different direction, like making it a full dashboard builder or something, right? That's still Grafana land. but for the things we do want to make them nice and make especially the query building and understanding experience nice. So that's kind of my goal there.
Yeah, I really like personally the metrics exploration, that you can really see the labels, their dimensionality, and the filtering that is all no code, no PromQL needed, just to toggle. I want this, and that, and then you get once you have the one that is fit for you, with a click of a button, it switches over to show you the results for that. So really nice experience. Again, I learned about that from your demos over social media, so you can learn a lot from that. And you mentioned, so UI is found obviously on the Prometheus UI, but then there are other components, right? There's in the alert manager and other places. So is that part of this work? Is there a vision for that? Can you share a bit more about how the more global UI experience that you're aiming at?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of a volunteer-ish open source project, so let's see what actually happens, right? But the idea is, if we had all the capacity in the world, tomorrow I will just rebuild the alert manager UI in the same framework with the same style. When that's actually going to happen and by whom, we'll see. But that's the goal, the aspiration. Like, the people have basically agreed, when we can do this, we would like the alert manager UI to adopt a similar style and the same technical framework under the hood. If someone feels like they're really, they want a UI project challenge, maybe that could also be an invite here, but then you have a lot of responsibility for leading that. But yeah, that's the goal. And like, these are the two major server components that have UIs, and the alert manager UI currently looks very different because it's not even React, it's based on Elm. Not many people know Elm. So yeah, that was kind of one of the other reasons for why we eventually wanted to replace it now with a React app. But yeah, when that is going to happen, I cannot tell you. It's probably really reliant on my own free time and motivation, and maybe someone else's who wants to pick it up.
Yeah, and then the same point was brought up also in an episode I had a year ago, actually, with Augustin Husson, which is another maintainer of the Prometheus, and also specifically with a specialty on the front-end part. So I was asking him, as a front-end guy, what do you think about it? And he shared the same vision. It was also after the discussion that you have in the dev days after PromCon. So it was definitely also a topic that came up between the maintainers on the dev day. So sounds like it's some things started to move, and some things, as you said, are waiting. So a call for all the people out there that want to get involved and bring some experience with front end and UI. Definitely something that can help there. I want to move to another topic, which is OpenTelemetry compatibility. So we've been covering OpenTelemetry extensively here on the show, Open Observability Talks. So obviously a lot about Prometheus, but also a lot about OpenTelemetry major projects. Also a project under the CNCF, by the way, now applying for graduation, in the process of evaluating for graduation. And I know that Prometheus had a lot of work done already to support OpenTelemetry metrics, already started existing at 2.x. Here's something that I shared back in a day that I wrote for the audience who was not familiar with the work that has been done. I'm pasting it here for the folks here, but I know that this is also a major theme for 3.0. So can you share with us about this thing?
Yeah, so there's, of course, many more points that we probably should talk about in terms of 3.0. From native histograms to remote write 2.0 and so on. But OpenTelemetry is one major theme at the moment for Prometheus in general. Not all of that will land directly at the 3.0 release, but basically, more and more people are using OpenTelemetry and feeding it into Prometheus as a backend for the metrics part. And there are still some compatibility issues, different character sets, right? Like Prometheus metric names don't support dots, for example. So there, the Prometheus team is working on full UTF-8 support for metric names and label names in the future. So that's coming. It's not going to directly land in 3.0, but it's going to come sometime, hopefully in the next few months. We have the compatibility issue, or the thing that resource labels that are attached and coming from OpenTelemetry metrics, they're very verbose and numerous. And they're kind of a similar concept to target labels in Prometheus, except target labels are attached by the Prometheus server, not by the source. But they also identify kind of where something's come from. And they work differently. They're more stable. They're less numerous and verbose. So they kind of work better for attaching them to all your metrics. If you try to attach all resource metrics to all resource attributes to all your metrics, then the metrics would get like super polluted and unstable. So we have to work on a better way of allowing the user to configure, similar as they currently do it with service discovery and target labels, which resource attributes they want to map over into every metric from a source, versus which ones do I only put on like a single info metric that I can then join in if I really need to. So there's work going on there. Health monitoring is another compatibility issue, where normally when the Prometheus server pulls normal Prometheus endpoints, not OTel ones, it records a metric name, a metric with the name up, and the value set to 0 or 1, depending on whether the scrape succeeded or failed. So you can know for everything that should exist in the world, is it currently up or down? And with a push-based model, it's way harder to do that. So, especially if some process never pushed data, right? Then how do you know that it's supposed to be there? So there's work going on, or thinking going on at least. That's a bit more long-term probably, for how to join up service discovery with push-based sources. So you can still discover a view of all the things that should exist, and then have some joining label to join it in with incoming data to see like, okay, there is actually data in for the data coming in for this thing we discovered and that we expect to exist. And then you could synthesize an up metric based on that again and have similar kind of health monitoring. Then we have out of order ingestion. So in the Prometheus server, normally you can only append to existing time series, and you cannot add a sample to a time series that has an older timestamp than the last one that you just appended. But you can experimentally add, and now actually with Prometheus 3, it's no longer experimental, so it's going to be stable. You can enable out of order ingestion for a specified time window, like. And OTel needs this because OpenTelemetry doesn't guarantee that data is delivered in order. So it might be that a sample from 5 minutes ago arrives, right? But you've already sent one from 1 minute ago. So now without this extra setting, you wouldn't be able to append it to Prometheus. So we're going to make support for that stable in 3.0. You still have to configure these append windows, but it's going to be fine. At some point,
I have to say that I love the append feature. Sorry, the out of order. Also for other reasons, I can tell you, having worked in the observability space for quite some time, you do find different scenarios that you got some disconnects, network or otherwise, and then you need to backfill some of the time series data. So I think this feature is amazing to have, and not just for the compatibility with OTel. So just my 2 cents on the out of order.
That's true. Yeah, it does have other uses as well. Yeah. We have, okay, what else is there? We have, so currently, last time I checked at least, the metadata, like the description of a metric and the type and so on, of a metric, when you push it via the OTLP receiver into Prometheus, it didn't make it into Prometheus properly. So I hope that will happen at some point. I'm not sure when, if it hasn't happened by now. But another thing is, like, there is this OTLP receiver in the Prometheus server that you can enable, right? It's a push-based endpoint, so you can actually affect the server state. So you have to explicitly enable it. It was experimental, and now with 3.0, it will be stable. So that's a good thing as well. And it has been made more efficient. So there's less of a performance hit if you use OTel with Prometheus. And then finally,
So it's a Prometheus receiver, just for the audience to understand. So it's a Prometheus receiver for OpenTelemetry, for OTel, to push OTLP to Prometheus server, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is a big departure from Prometheus's original model of we pull only, right? The server pulls. If you want to push, then you have to use some intermediary thing like the push gateway or some aggregating proxy that Prometheus can pull from. But with the OTLP receiver...
Yeah, and I should mention, just to complement the fuller picture, if you do work with OpenTelemetry collector, you can still use the pull mode with an appropriate receiver. So OpenTelemetry collector can work in a pull mode to fetch from the target. So you, just for the audience not to understand, not to think that if you work with OpenTelemetry, it has to be push mode. If you have native Prometheus endpoint exporters that you want to scrape, you can scrape them with an OpenTelemetry collector with the right receiver.
Yep, definitely.
What else? Do you want to say anything else on the OpenTelemetry compatibility side?
Yeah, one more thing is delta temporality support. So in Prometheus, for example, counters are always cumulative. They just keep on increasing. When the process starts, they start at 0, and then you count requests, and the counters, they just go up and up and up over the lifetime of the process. And then at some point, the process restarts, and then they may reset to 0, but they're cumulative. And in OTel, you can have either that, or you can have delta temporality, which means for every metric reporting period, like every time you push in OTel, right? Let's say every 15 seconds, you actually just send the delta of what has happened in those 15 seconds, which is fine in a push-based model. But for pull, it's a little bit more difficult, especially if a pull is supposed to be idempotent, right? You have one target that just counts how many requests it has, and it may or may not be scraped by 0, 1, 2, 3, or however many Prometheus servers that all scrape at different intervals and different times. And a scrape should not reset the internal count, right? And so that's why the cumulative model works way better with a pull model. And but some observability vendors only, for example, support delta temporality. And so like OTel also had to support delta temporality. And so currently, when you send data, delta temporality metrics via OTLP to let's say the OTLP receiver in the Prometheus server, like trying to send that there, I think if I remember correctly, the entire request just fails if they're not ignored, but it doesn't work. And the idea is we do want to, or at least there's ideas for making that work as well, where deltas are converted into cumulative metrics upon ingestion, which requires comparing to the previous state of the metric and adding the current one and so on. And it's not clear yet exactly how that will work, as far as I'm aware. Like, I'm not too close to that issue. But yeah, that's another thing to watch out for. Although, usually, and if you can, you should just tell your OTel library, like, just send cumulative metrics and you'll currently be fine. But for some people, that might be complicated.
Yeah.
So I think that's it on the... Sorry, yeah, on the OTel compatibility issues and like what the different ideas and sometimes current plans and features are to make Prometheus a better backend for OTel metrics. It's still going to be a little bit of a philosophy mismatch between how the two worlds work, but it's going to be better than what it is now.
Yeah, I think it's as you said, there are some things that people treat as almost a religion, I would say, when they talk about it. There was actually there's a group under the CNCF, a working group dealing with Prometheus and OpenTelemetry compatibility. This is how big a topic it is. And there was even a user survey. I'm just looking now to see if I can find. I actually tweeted about it very recently, and it was very interesting to see about asking users themselves what they see as valuable, what they're accustomed to, what they see as critical, even if they're accustomed, if it's okay to change or not. Some of that is what you mentioned about, like whether it's dot notation or underscore notation or whatnot. Some of them was about other things, and it's very interesting to see that some users are very passionate about about this topic, and some of them are less. And more of that, you can really see that when you the same people were asked, are you a developer or are you an SRE? Are you a Prometheus user, or are you an OTel user or whatnot? And you really saw the split according according to where they come from. So I'm putting, by the way, I'm pasting it here for the audience to check it out. It's a fascinating report. So I highly suggest reading that, but I think it really boils down to the essence of how we bridge these gaps as a community, and the two communities actually together to bring something that will be useful both ends. That's and there's a question here from the audience that we might not have been clear. So Axel has been asking here, when will Prometheus 3.0 be released? So we were mentioning 3.0, but maybe we should say it more explicitly.
Yeah, so the current plan is to do it next week at PromCon, or if you're listening to the recording, it will already have happened. And like basically press the release button on stage in the talk about Prometheus 3. Now, of course, it could happen that there's like some bad circumstances where someone discovers some, really critical late thing that still needs to be fixed, and then it doesn't happen. But that's the current plan. If it doesn't happen on stage, it happens like a couple of days later, hopefully. But yeah, hopefully on stage.
Yeah, and again, by the time the episode is released to the podcast apps, you should already have that released. Should be a done deal. And some of the themes that are big themes of the 3.0 obviously will carry on beyond the 3.0 into minor things, or might not be stable still, and some work will carry on. But these are the main themes that you mentioned. And maybe in that regard, you mentioned briefly native histograms. You want to say a word about that? That's been a major theme also before, but I think we've done a lot of work there.
Yeah, native histograms are awesome, and to a large part Björn Rabenstein's brainchild. They already exist in Prometheus now, and they're experimental, and they will still be experimental for a while. So that's one thing where we thought, let's really get it right, versus just saying, okay, they're stable now for 3.0, and then some stuff will not be quite nice. But yeah, they're definitely already usable now in some ways, and I can really recommend them. And basically what they give you is way higher histogram resolution at lower cost. There's two main concepts with the native histograms, or maybe first I should describe the classic histograms in Prometheus if you're not aware how they work. Basically, a histogram tells you in which latency. I'm just using the example of request latency here because it's the most common use case in systems monitoring for histograms. For each latency bucket of an application, like how many different requests there have been. And in classic histograms, you had one time series per bucket that you track. And so there's a label on each bucket telling you like which latency range this bucket is for. And these buckets are pretty, like, you have to manually choose them in your instrumentation. And if you don't choose them very right, then you don't capture quite the right resolution and the right detail that you want. And they're really expensive because you have this one time series per bucket situation with the classic ones. Because, you basically need that to represent histograms somehow in a metric format that just knows about metric names, label sets, and a single float 64 sample value of the time series. Now, the big thing with native histograms is that the sample value of a single time series can no longer just be a float 64, but can also be an entire binary encoded histogram. So you can have a single time series that contains an entire histogram, which makes the indexing and handling of that time series way, 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 way cheaper. And then inside that histogram sample, it's also structured very differently. Instead of instead of a few manually configured buckets, now it's basically, it's a sparse histogram that's high resolution, that only stores the bucket ranges that actually have requests. And it basically happens automatically under the hood. So in your instrumentation, you just kind of configure an exponential factor, like how much wider should each subsequent bucket be, and the library does everything for you under the hood. And then there's still ways, if you really need it, to specify custom buckets as well. Like if you need a bucket boundary at a specific latency range or something, that still is like an add-on feature that has currently been added. So mainly the takeaway is going to be for users, because a lot of people have these cost and server stability issues when they introduce very detailed histograms, that this will all get way better. Like switch to native histograms as soon as you can. They're going to give you way better resolution for like way less cost, and even the PromQL gets in many situations a little bit simpler. So they're really nice.
And it's in terms of there's also, they can come with a textual representation, but there's also a more efficient representation, right? Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, currently they do require a new protocol buffer-based transfer format for scraping them from targets. It's automatically negotiated if you enable native histograms, like in your client library. I'm always talking about the Go world here. I think Java has them already, or some other client library already has them, but they're not in every client library yet. And that's because the many different buckets that each histogram can have, so it's going to be way more buckets than previously. You want to encode them efficiently. And the first thinking was, that's going to be easier in protobuf. But apparently there's still actually now some, if I remember something correctly that I read recently, there's still some efficiency issues around encoding them and decoding them from protobuf. So people are actually also thinking, like, should we still add a text format representation for them? I'm not too deeply into that conversation, but I heard something like that. And so there may or may not be a textual way of getting native histograms out of your services as well. Like the text-based exposition format has been the traditional one to get metrics from a service process into Prometheus. And we will still, like, the format will still stick around for a long time. Prometheus server, it will still be like compatible with it for a long time. The question is only like, should that new feature also be retrofit into it? And I'll have to pass on that a little bit at the moment.
Sounds good. And another big thing is remote write 2.0. What do you want to say about that?
Yeah, so the current remote write format, so for those of you who don't know it, there's like kind of two different metrics transfer formats, right? There's the one that Prometheus uses to scrape metrics from services, or we call them targets. That's this format we just talked about, the text-based one usually, that is really easy to produce and to ingest. And then there's this other format that Prometheus uses when it itself pushes already collected data on to some other remote source. And the remote other source is usually some either long-term storage that, whether it's Cortex or Mimir or some cloud provider. Like often it's cloud providers, right? Like you run a Prometheus locally and then you forward all your collected data to whatever your cloud provider is that has some remote write compatible interface. And that one has always been a more like, has been protobufs and different characteristics, because you want to transfer the time series of all targets at once, and in a binary way, and so it's different than the format that you use to scrape metrics from a single target. It was very nice and simplistic and worked well for a long time, but it had some downsides, which is it was a bit network hungry. It it was hard to retrofit some of the newer features into it in a proper way, like metrics metadata, like the help unit type and so on, exemplar data, native histograms, again, like in that format, they're also relevant. And then also what's for OpenTelemetry also, and for some cloud providers that receive the data, more relevant is the created timestamp for, let's say, when did a counter start counting? Like when was a counter actually created, right? And so these 4 features, they will be more properly supported in the new Prometheus remote write format. So better metadata support, exemplars, native histograms, and created timestamps. Some of them are already unofficially, experimentally kind of added to remote write 1, but the new one will be better. And so it's going to be more efficient in terms of network bandwidth. Strings, like labels and metric names, are only going to be stored once and then just referenced. So like string interning, right? So, and then on top of that, you have snappy compression. It's the same compression as remote write 1. Still going to be protobuf and everything. And, you know, the people at Grafana Labs who mainly built this, they did a lot of just experiments with what combinations of string interning and compression around it like yielded the best kind of trade-offs in low network bandwidth, but also still not increasing the CPU and memory too much for actually producing that content. And that's kind of what they came up with. So yeah, it's still a stateless protocol, and it's just going to be more feature rich and more efficient.
Yeah, and all the deduplication and data compression is definitely going to benefit everyone there. So that's nice. Anything else on the 3.0 scope that we forgot to cover so far?
So maybe one thing that I should notice that is not directly part of the Prometheus server release, but that's also happening kind of around the same time and will also be talked about at PromCon, is the new governance. So currently we have a governance that is a bit of a high barrier for new contributors to really reach positions in the project that are meaningful and that they can then, go to the employers with and say like, hey, I'm a so-and-so in the Prometheus team. Can you sponsor me to work on Prometheus? Basically, we have team members. We have about 30 of them at the moment who have like full voting rights. And then we have maintainers, and they can like maintain a repo here and there, but they don't really have any big rights in the project. And the idea of the new governance is, I think it's like either inspired by the Kubernetes one or by one of the other CNCF ones, to have more tiers for like contributors and maintainers. And like at the very top, there's a steering committee that's going to be fewer people than the current team members who vote on everything. So it's just going to be like a handful of people. So it's going to be easier at the lower levels for people to get like titles and permissions and responsibilities that are clearly outlined. And yeah, that just basically makes the project more inviting for people to join. And we'll still, in the very end, like there's the new governance is already laid out. I can't point to the doc right now, but in the end, the Prometheus team will still have to formally vote on it, like to actually replace the current governance with a new governance. But it looks like that should only be a formality, because pretty much everyone has been agreeing so far.
Nice. And another thing, you mentioned the formats. We talked about the exposition format, and we talked about the remote write format. I think a word maybe we should say about the OpenMetrics, that was actually created from the original Prometheus format and spun off to its own project under the CNCF, with the aspiration of making something bigger, larger than just Prometheus, sort of a tool agnostic, vendor agnostic format. And actually, just recently, the decision has been made to fold OpenMetrics back into Prometheus. So OpenMetrics, if you do use or follow, it's officially archived and folded into Prometheus. So just wanted to get your take on the OpenMetrics front.
Yeah, I mean, it was just this effort to try to make the Prometheus format into an open standard and IETF, RFC internet standard, and somehow that never fully completed. It's and then there was OpenTelemetry and all these things happening. So I forgot all the exact reasonings behind the decision in the end to just say, okay, yeah, let's just, Prometheus is the one project that actually majorly is involved with this and that scrapes this and that really depends on how this exactly works. Let's archive it as a separate project and just continue the same effort in Prometheus land. Richard Hartmann or some of the other people more closely involved would be able to tell you more like details of what exactly happened there. But basically, as a format, it still exists. Like if you look at the accept header that Prometheus sends to a target, it will accept OpenMetrics and then also the original, like the OpenMetrics format is very similar to Prometheus's original text-based format. They look like almost the same if you just look at them, but then there's like very minor differences between them. So you do need to differentiate them in the protocol header. But yeah, so the future is just the Prometheus team deciding how we actually want to evolve that format, like more tightly in combination with Prometheus.
Yeah, I think it's the right thing to do given the dynamics. I even put here a link to a post that I posted about the update and also my take on that. I think with the aspiration of having a vendor neutral thing, the fact being that you see that these formats are coupled, if not tightly coupled, with the way that of the storage representation, of the internal data representation. So trying to get something that will be vendor agnostic when vendors do things that are so well optimized for good reasons, by the way. You want things to be performant. And when you try to do that, InfluxDB and I don't know, and Prometheus and whatnot, and each one has its own different way of internal representation. That's hard. And I'm a strong believer in open standardization and open spec, but I think in that case it made perfect sense. As you said, the affinity to Prometheus was clear. Prometheus ecosystem was the by far the major ecosystem to consume it, so it makes sense to be part of Prometheus. But yeah, so anyway, whoever uses OpenMetrics or is confused, or I think it also created some confusion also because they're so similar, but then there are the subtle differences. So even Prometheus users got sometimes a bit confused. So I think it will reduce some confusion even within the Prometheus ecosystem. So I think a good move altogether. So I pasted the link for those who want to read a bit more about that. Let's look a bit forward. So in terms of roadmap, looking beyond that, is there any specific thing that we haven't mentioned but you want to mention in terms of longer term roadmap that has been in discussion?
No, I think we talked about most of the things because some of those were also more longer term roadmaps still. Like I think native histograms will still take a while to become fully stable. And yeah, other than that, the ecosystem around Prometheus is always evolving, whether it's Mimir, Cortex, Thanos, or different cloud providers, or other integrations like just being created or offering more features and so on. But I think those were the most important and most exciting new things happening in the Prometheus land at the moment.
Yeah, so maybe adding to that one more, which is the Perses, which is another open source project that has just been accepted to the CNCF. Again, pasting here the link for more information. But Perses, for those who are not familiar, and when people ask me what it is, I actually often tell them what you tweeted during last year's PromCon. I think you said a new open source dashboard builder project with a GitOps first approach and the goal of making it a CNCF alternative to Grafana. I think that's roughly what you said back in the day, and I think it nails it down. So I think now the first step towards this goal is reached. It's on the CNCF sandbox, the first level of maturity within the CNCF. So maybe a word from you. Why do we even need an alternative to Grafana?
Yeah, and so I'm not a spokesperson of Perses, but I sometimes look at it and I root for it. So yeah, I mean, basically Prometheus is part of the CNCF. It's under a very permissive Apache license. But if you use Prometheus, you basically have to use Grafana these days. Like 99-point-something% of Prometheus users will depend and really require Grafana for their Prometheus use case. And Grafana is awesome, but it does have its downsides. It's very complex, of course, including its JSON format. It's not permissively licensed, even though it's still open source with the AGPL. It's owned by a company. It's not, the governance is not neutral, right? It's owned by a company that may tomorrow decide again to switch the license to whatever they want. They already did it once. And so for me, I just think it would be nice to have a completely openly governed, permissively licensed, CNCF controlled alternative, or something that at least becomes an alternative over time for building dashboards based on Prometheus data. And that was the goal of Perses, plus having a more GitOps approach. So if you're familiar with the JSON format that you can use to define Grafana dashboards, it grew very organically over the years, and it became quite chaotic. And everyone who kind of tries to programmatically generate dashboards, has a bit of trouble with it. And so with Perses, the idea was, let's define a clean dashboard data model from the ground up, and then really aim for this GitOps first approach, where you check in your dashboards and then they get auto-deployed and provisioned for you from this format. There's still UI-based editing features. As far as I know, like I haven't, I'm not a Perses expert, but you can still edit the UI, and then I don't know how they save it currently, like whether it actually gets persisted somewhere, the new JSON, or whether you have to download it. But I'm rooting for this effort in general. And yeah, it's still early days for Perses, and I'm wishing them well and hope that they can continue being, from sandbox to graduating and so on. Oh, you're muted again.
So it's a young project. It's important to say, obviously, it's not yet a full alternative to Grafana because of the feature richness and maturity, but it's an important step in that direction, and definitely rooting for the project. You also mentioned the long-term storage ecosystem around it. Obviously, within the CNCF, we have Thanos and Cortex open source projects, and then outside the CNCF, we have Mimir, which started as a fork of Cortex by Grafana Labs, and there are others. What's your take? I know that you're not a maintainer of the individual ones, but when you look at it as a Prometheus master, looking at the ecosystem, what's your take on the current stand of long-term storage or scalable, let's say, offerings for Prometheus?
Yeah, man, it's really hard to even know all of them because there's so many by now. And of course, these are some of the most well-known ones, but I don't follow them like too closely either. But yeah, it's great that they exist. I think, Cortex and Mimir, they're great if you want to run an open source but centralized for your organization observability cluster that stores all your data where you send it. And then Thanos is what actually way more people use, who kind of want to integrate with existing Prometheus servers, but add a layer on top that aggregates multiple Prometheus servers into a single query layer, and also with long-term storage via object storage and so on. So I think for most people, Thanos will probably be the way to go. And we did that at PromCon once, like raise your hand if you're using Cortex, and then like very few people raised their hands, and like raise your hand if you're using Thanos, and like almost the whole room raised their hand. I don't know if that's still the same nowadays, but the Thanos approach is a little bit less like, hey, let's build one big centralized cluster and let's have more of a still Prometheus servers in the loop, but have a layer on top that cares about long-term storage and about an integrated query view, so you can do PromQL over multiple Prometheus servers at once. And concretely in Thanos land at the moment, I know of two exciting developments. So one is native tenancy support. Cortex and Mimir have had this for a long time, because in a big centralized cluster with many like different services sending their data, you need that. But in Thanos, that was not explicitly supported yet. So now you can send data from different tenants, like different owners of data, and it's properly tracked throughout the system. And then you can also configure the system in such a way that each tenant can only query their own data. It's still optional, but like that's now officially natively added. And then also there's work going on distributed query execution. So you imagine, like, if you have this tree of queryers, you can push some query processing down to the leaf nodes. Let's say you're summing over a bunch of rates, then you could do some partial sums in each leaf node first, and then like sum up the sums, for example, right? And so there's work going on in that regard. So there's still lots of features and optimizations happening in those projects, but yeah, I'm not too close to them to say much more.
Yeah, I find it also interesting that you start seeing also players that are all the players that you mentioned are full Prometheus compatible. I'm leaving the official definition. I'm talking about taking the API, the PromQL syntax, and everything. And we start seeing vendors or tools or open sources that take a slightly different approach, that take variants of sorts of the official Prometheus supported, like VictoriaMetrics and PhiloDB, and do some PhiloDB. Actually, you were introducing it to me, so you maybe you come.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also a trend, at least that I see, alongside the 100% compatible is the 90, I don't know, something percent compatible Prometheus long-term storage or solutions, right?
Yeah, and of course, as the co-founder of Prometheus and being very close to Prometheus, I'm a bit protective, and I want, when people say that they're compatible, I want them to be fully compatible. But I think the most important thing is that they're very clear to their users, so that users don't have a surprise, trying to depend on some PromQL feature, and then they switch from native Prometheus to some supposedly compatible platform, and it doesn't work the same anymore. And maybe as a result, an alert will not fire anymore, right? That could happen, and that could actually be really bad. But it really depends on the specific incompatibilities. Like, is the numeric output value slightly different for your rates after some decimal points, or do you behave completely differently for some binary operator or something? And so you have to. And I think just like making that very explicit and transparent is important. And there's been various initiatives. I've been testing vendors for the compatibility in the past. You can find that in the PromLabs blog. And there's also been the Prometheus Conformance Program initiative, which we need to make more progress on again to kind of finalize the legal part of it. But the idea was we offer a technical suite of tests for vendors to self-test and say, I've tested my PromQL implementation and my storage and so on and so on. So now I can officially say, with a logo and a mark, I'm Prometheus compatible, either as like a full storage backend, or as, we defined certain subgroupings of components you may want to implement and say you're compatible for. But yeah, the legal paperwork part of that is kind of hasn't seen movement in the last years. Let's see if that still happens. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
But I'm not pushing that forward myself at the moment.
No, it's okay. I actually discussed that a while back with Richie Altman here on the show, and he's one of the initiators of this conformance program. Yeah, it's a bit stuck, I think, but I'm not a fan of the legal side and official. I think that you need to understand if your open source is meant to be compatible or not, and you should be, as you said, very clear and transparent about what you offer, and if you offer Prometheus compatible or not, or a variant, so that the users know what they get. But anyway, we're reaching the end of the episode, and I think it was a fascinating discussion. Lots of good goodies that come out around this month, the PromCon month, and a lot of good announcements. So thanks so much for sharing with us. Usually at the end of the shows, I do a sort of breaking news. We're out of time, so maybe just one thing about Kubernetes 1.31 that was released, and lots of goodies there. So follow it. I actually highlighted in a short post things that are specifically on observability, since we're here on Open Observability Talks. Things such as metric cardinality enforcement by the BEA, proposed time series data to make it a bit more manageable on what Kubernetes components actually emit. also exposing device health information on pod status and other things. So I'm pasting it here for the audience, for whoever wants to check it out. I think interesting things that come out, and big congrats, obviously, for the team that led this release. And with that, we're reaching the end. So thank you so much, Julius, for joining me on this episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great, and everyone follow Julius Volz on the social media. The links are there, and of course, as always, all the episodes are available on your favorite podcast apps or on YouTube. So just look up Open Observability Talks on your wherever you consume your podcast. And if you do listen to that on the podcast apps, do know that we stream the episodes live on Twitch and YouTube Live. So follow us on Twitter or X at OpenObserve to get the live stream times, and also to stay updated on more deep dives and so on. And feel free to give us a thumbs up if you did like the episode. I'm Dotan Horvitz. Thank you very much for listening. See you on next month's episode. And as I always say, you know what it is? May the open source be with you.
I have no idea.